Welcome to the first ever episode of Between Two Wheels, a show about e-scooters from people who build them. Your hosts are Eloi, the CTO of Apollo Scooters, and myself, Mac, the CMO of Apollo Scooters. The whole concept behind Between Two Wheels is to leverage our experience. Eloi's been to China how many times?
9 times.
9 times. He's visited how many factories?
At least 25.
And I've been helping Eloi sell his amazing scooters for the last 5 years. So combined, we have quite a bit of experience when it comes to electric scooters, both the commuters, the mid-range, as well as the high performance. So what we're gonna give you that no other reviewer can is we're gonna open up the scooter, look at the components, look at what's inside, look at who made those scooters and those parts, who put them together, how are they tested, and how do they stack up versus our own internal testing. Today, we have no scooter other than the Segway MAX G2, arguably the best-selling scooter on the market. So, Eloi, as the resident expert on e-scooters, why don't you kick us off with your first impressions of the Segway MAX G2?
As you said, one of the best-selling scooter on the market, and it's the evolution of the Segway Max that looked identical before, but without a suspension. That was also one of the best-selling one. So it's interesting to finally be able to open one to see if it justifies all the hype that we see around it. We've been big fans of Segway, right? It's a big competitor of Apollo.
Our number one competitor.
Our number one competitor. And, you know, it's interesting because Segway has all the resource in the world, right? They are worth $5 billion. They are a public company. They do a suite of product from lawnmower to battery pack to a quad VTT, right? So it's interesting to finally be able to see the kind of engineering that all of this can bring to a scooter. And are we this far off from a big company like this?
Yeah, it's always a good question. If you look at their resources, they're what, 1,000-fold bigger than Apollo? This is just a number out of thin air. If you look at our scooters, are they better than our scooters? Arguably, maybe, maybe not. I guess we'll find out today. An interesting bit of history for anyone not familiar with Segway. Segway was originally an American company, right? Famous for those two-wheeler Segways. And then Ninebot, a Chinese company, came in and acquired them. So that's how we ended up with Segway Ninebot, which is what is written on this scooter today. And as Eloi mentioned, this is the second iteration of the famous Max. The Max was introduced to the market, I believe, back in 2021, something like this. Yeah, and it was the main difference between this version and the first version is, the suspension, right? The suspension was kind of the number one difference, and I believe there was some technology.
Suspension, little footrest too on this one.
Footrest. Apple Find My technology, right? Yes. It's integration, turn signals. So really kind of suspension mechanically, everything else was sort of a more minor feature, I suppose, if you will. But I think that the part that perhaps we're not addressing is why was the first version of the Max so revolutionary for its time? Do you remember?
It's hard to think about because there's nothing that stands out from the Max, right? There's no big displays. It looks okay. It's not like a piece of art. I think it's just how reliable it was. You know, people were buying it, seeing the good reviews. You had the big air tires too. So you had 10-inch tire, while the other big player was Xiaomi with the M365 that was 8.5-inch tires. And it's a low-maintenance scooter, right? Xiaomi, you have the disc brake. This one, you had the drum brake. And again, they were coming with the experience of Segway Ninebot, which is like it's a
brand name.
It's a brand name, yes.
I remember, when the first Max came out on Indiegogo, they had this asset that they created that stood out to me, which was you could take that scooter all the way from some part of San Francisco to some other part of San Francisco, and I think it was like 35 miles in range. And I remember that was kind of wow, right? That was revolutionary for its time because most scooters were not meant to go 35 miles. They were meant to go 10, maybe 5. So I think that was one of the big kind of aha moments that Segway was able to take advantage of.
Good value for money with the battery.
For money. That's right. So I mean, by the end of its lifespan, I guess the first version was selling for like $800, $700 USD. This bad boy, following the most recent price increase, is retailing for about $999, but obviously fluctuates kind of plus minus $100 depending on the time of the year. Any other final thoughts on your first impressions of this scooter?
I think it looks good overall. I like the yellow accent. It's something we realized when we went to China and visited all those factories, that there's an art of putting the colors on the right place on a scooter that It's not as simple as just putting yellow accent. On this one, you look at it and you see they tried to put like a 9-bot design on the side. They have like little branding on the grip tape.
Max, right?
Yes, Max, hydraulic suspension. You see all those little accents that combine together give a little sporty vibe with the suspension, and I like it.
But yeah, I mean, this is plastic at the end of the day, right? Like some of these clippers are plastic too. And so you realize that they're able to stitch together a scooter out of plastic and metal and rubber, and it looks good,
Yes.
right?
To get all the same finish, like shade between different material like this, it's extremely hard.
I agree. It's a good looking scooter. It's approachable, right? For somebody who's never ridden a scooter before, you're not going to be intimidated by looking at this. All right, well, so let's wrap up the first section, which is first impressions. What would you score the Segway Max G2 on a scale of 1 to 5, where 1 is the minimum score, 5 is the maximum score?
In terms of design?
In terms of your overall first impressions, we're basically saying if you were to see the scooter on the Best Buy shelf for the first time, what would you give it?
I have the eye of a scooter designer, so I'm a bit critical, but I think I would give it a 3.5 out of 5. You know, it's not necessarily a 4 because 4 is too close to 5, but it's not a 3 either or a 2 because it does look good. But again, like you mentioned, you can still see all the plastic part and a weird choice of screws that really stick out, eyesore. So I would say a 3.5, which I consider pretty high for my standard.
Eye of the designer right here. Screws are bothering him.
Yeah, 3.5.
Okay. I'm going to be a bit more generous. I would say a 4 for me as a less technical, less, I guess, design-driven shopper. You know, I would look at this scooter. Looks standard. Nothing memorable about it, but it looks inviting and makes you want to hop on it and ride it. So 3.5 and a 4 out of 5. So let's move on to the next section, which is build quality and design. So we're going right into the meat of this episode right away. So Eloi, why don't we start with the construction of the Segway Max G2? Can you tell me what are the materials it's built of? What is the durability of those materials, and how does that impact the overall quality of the scooter?
Yes. So the material, we have plastic, aluminum, obviously. And what is important when you make a scooter, it's how the aluminum is made. Are you extrusion, casting? Are you forging? So this one, we can see that, well, the first thing is it's really hard to see what it's made of under all the plastic. But we took it apart. We know what it's made under. They use steel for the fork. So for the rear fork and the front fork, you have a very thin fork made of steel, and then you put a plastic over it.
So
it's strong enough.
Plastic cover, you're saying there will be steel if
steel.
we take it off. Okay.
And a very small, it looks big, the fork, it's tiny. It's very big, maybe 4 millimeter thin, the fork on this. And it's fine because it's steel. It's just, this is gonna add weight to the scooter. So steel in the front and the back. The body here, we see that it's curving in the front here, the metal part. This means that it's not extrusion. It's made out of a casting or maybe welded inside. Maybe it's extruded and then welded. Both of these methods are fine. I would prefer if it was extruded, the body, welded to a casted front. It would just be stronger and cheaper to make. The neck, that's the classic neck that you see in 90% of the scooters. Extruded pipe like this, which is also fine. It's super solid. And you can see that they welded the base here and on the part where the steering goes in. It would be interesting to see if the neck is welded inside as well or just on the outside. Usually you want something welded on the inside as well. You might as well do it.
So in the way you're saying, this is one component, and then the deck is one component.
So I think that the logic way to make it, the cheapest way would be this is one component, this is another component in the front that you weld to this one, then you have all the plastic over it. The neck is one component, the front tube here is another component, and then you have a bunch of components for the turning of the direction turning inside and the stem.
And so we can see the welds here and here. Here you think it's just been buffed to make it
I think it's been buffed, yes.
Okay.
That would be the cheapest way to make a scooter, extruded and casting in the front.
Guess we'll see when we open it up.
We'll see when we open it up because they're not going to buff the weld inside the body.
Okay. And so just to go back to the first point you mentioned, which is, there's almost like this inner skeleton of the scooter, the steel frame, the metal components, and then there's the kind of exoskeleton, which is all plastic and much more decorative, right? So you think that Segway does this simply because they want to make it as design, friendly as possible? Is that really the only reason?
I think it's just easier to control QC like this because that's the main difference with, let's say, when you look at if we take the closest comparison, which is the Apollo Go, right, in our mind. And the Apollo Go, you see all the frame, it's exposed, right? The fork is exposed,
Right.
the body is exposed. There's no plastic on the scooter except for the fender and the throttle. This is all plastic. If there's a scratch on the frame during the build or whatever, well, it's on the frame and you need to rework the piece, right? It's complicated. And to get the same finish on all the frames is really hard. Compared that when you have a plastic part that is not even painted, it's coming out of the mold this color. It's a lot easier to, when you have scratch, to replace it. And it's also cheaper when you have a thin, because you don't need to finish a frame as well as we finish it. It's just a thin piece of steel that can be stamped and you put plastic over it. So
More
I
forgiving
think,
in a way.
yes, when you pump out millions of these per year, it's definitely easier to do it this way and more scalable, to be honest.
And are there any implications on the quality of the scooter because of that?
I think for most riders, it's still going to be fine. Like this is a reliable scooter, but when you put it on maybe more extreme cases, like we do, right? We put it on testing rigs that we have in China, and we put this model on our rigs in China. That's where you see that it's either that we overtest with our rig or this scooter is not strong enough. But in terms of difference between our scooter and this scooter on the testing rig, it's a factor of like a multiple of 10. How quick this one's going to snap compared to ours. So I think for everyday use, it's fine, but it seems like in extreme cases, it's snapping really, really quickly.
Interesting. So it sounds like they know exactly what it's designed for. If you play within that, you're going to be totally fine.
Yes.
But the second you push it to a little bit beyond that limit, it's not going to hold
Yes.
up as well. And so that's really interesting, first of all. But second of all, can you comment on maybe how that impacts the maintenance aspect of the scooter? Is there any impact on the maintenance of the scooter? Do you have to work more on the scooter to keep it in good shape because of that design choice?
I would say if one thing, it's probably easier because again, if you scratch the plastic, you can replace it. Comparing to scratching a fork, a frame component, it's definitely more attached to the scooter, right? There's more screws to remove to be able to detach the frame compared to plastic covers. So I would say there's that, but on the flip side, well, it's harder to scratch a metal part than a plastic part, right? So, but I know for a fact that this one, maintenance-wise, it's pretty low. And even if we look at the design choice, the suspension is completely covered. You have a front drum brake that they even covered the spring. They have a suspension that is completely sealed. The fender coverage is great as well, so waterproofness should be pretty solid on this model. They have an interesting choice of design that it's the bottom cover that can be removed instead of the top cover. I'm not a fan of this because all the water goes under the deck, so water is easier to get in there compared to that when you have it under the grip tape that is completely sealed. But overall, it's a pretty low maintenance scooter. And even the suspension, when you disassemble the whole direction and you look at the hydraulic front suspension, it's all enclosed into a solid shaft that we were not even able to open. So I would suspect that water and dust will not go in there.
So overall, it sounds like the design choices they made seem appropriate for what the scooter is meant
Yes.
to do, right?
Yes.
Okay. So now, great introduction. Let's break it down a little bit more by component. If we can start from the top and we can stand up and walk around it, look at it. But let's break it down by component, starting from the handlebar, and then I would love to hear your thoughts on what you think of the folding mechanism, the tire choices, the self-healing, the size, the profile, brakes, suspension.
Yeah, for sure. Display is very minimal on this scooter. You have the speed, the gear, battery, and some indication if the lights are on, if you're on cruise control. That's about it, which is fine. We also have very simple display, and you can read it pretty well under the reflection of the sun. So the display is fine. Then what is nice is you have some room to put regular accessories. It's a 22 millimeter handlebar, so you can mount any bike accessories on it, which we know that our customer love as well. And this scooter, again, it's sold like in Best Buy and Amazon and everything. So, and they do sell all those accessories that goes with it for bikes. So it's a easy upsell, right? Throttle, it's fine as well. We share the same supplier of throttle as them, which great throttles, very simple, right? Up and down, no buttons integrated or anything, no regen. On the left side, you have the turning signal, which is new to this edition of the Max with the G2 Max with the suspension. Now you have a horn and you have turning signal, both on one side, which we also know customer love to have the quick access there. The grip handle are pretty beefy on this one. They feel big in hands, which is fine. And lastly, you have the turning signal, which on one side, they're great because they're covered. If you drop the scooter, they're not gonna crack. On the other side, we hear from our wholesalers that those turning signals do fail, and to replace them, apparently, it's a nightmare. All the wire management and everything, there's no wires exposed, right? So it's all going in the headset, in the handlebar, and then the headset, which means that this handlebar is a C-shaped handlebar, right? It's a handlebar with a groove built in.
So sorry, just to clarify, you're saying the handlebar isn't a pipe. It isn't like a fully round
It's
piece of
not
metal?
a pipe. It's there's like a key slot in it, all the way across the handlebar, and this allows to fish wires inside. It's fine. Sometimes it can create weakness depending on how it's attached to the headset, but from my knowledge, I've never seen an handlebar fell on a 9-butt. So it's decent. Then we go down, we have the headlight. Headlight pretty solid. This one has the ISO certification as well, which is very expensive to get for an electric scooter. It does a decent job. We go down, you have a front reflector and 2 side reflector as well, which is for regulation. It's not for design. Mostly in Europe, but it's nice that they did it for here as well. And it's all mounted with screws, so I would believe you can just remove it if you don't like them. And we have a single front drum brake. This is a hot debate. Some people don't like front drum brake because they are scared that they're going to flip over the bar. But at the same time, when you brake with the front rather than the rear, the stopping distance is much shorter, right? Then we go down. We have the folding mechanism. This is a proven folding mechanism from Segway. It works pretty well. We saw some failure on it, but any folding mechanism is going to have some failure. This one is decent, and the engineering of it makes sense. I think this one is not the easiest to adjust with this kind of big screw that you turn, but it's not the most complicated either. So I like this choice, and it makes sense. And what is interesting with the stem is that you have a safety on the side, which is this little button. It's plastic, but it does the job. I think it's just more user-friendly, but in terms of durability, it's the exact same thing.
Well, I think just going back to how heavy this scooter is, and we'll kind of talk about the specs later, but it's not really a scooter you're folding all that often, right?
Yes.
I mean, maybe to put it in the trunk, but for the most part, you just roll it in, roll it out, so it just needs to stay tight. That's kind of the main takeaway.
And you see that they have weld at the bottom of the stem between the junction of the folding and the stem, and they decided to cover it with a plastic ring.
Again, back to the main theme, right?
Yes.
I guess those are the details that, again, only a designer would really notice, right? Like, why is there a discrepancy between the thickness of the stem here and kind of the thickness of the base here, right? Is it jarring looking at this? Like, does it just look out of balance?
I personally, I think it's fine. I understand why they did that. It's because they share the same folding mechanism on all the other models, which have different stem on the GT2, for example, or the P100.
So you're saying to have one piece of one part across multiple models, they have no choice but to essentially cover it up.
Exactly, exactly. And one could say, well, okay, it's easier for a spare part as well because you have one, but the stem is welded, so you still need to have all those spare parts coming with it. But on the factory side, definitely easier to do this.
And probably cheaper too, because you just get to produce more, right?
For sure, it's easier to control. You can invest more money into the mold and to the QC control of it, so you're gonna have less defect at the end of the line.
So is that, would you say, one of the main kind of advantages of this approach for Segway, where the reason they're able to bring the scooter to market at $999 or $899 is potentially because they're not just producing this scooter, they're producing this stem for this model, the P100, and probably 3 other ones.
If we continue, the thing I like the most about this scooter is how the direction is mounted to the stem, right? Because you have the stem.
So what do you mean by direction to the stem?
So you have the direction here turning like this, and that's going to control, the front wheel, right? The direction of it. And it passes through the neck here. It's very complicated for a scooter to have the perfect tolerance for the bearing to fit in this part of the neck. And how do you link those two parts? Well, those two move and this one is fixed, right? How they did it? It's quite smart. And on top of that, they jammed an hydraulic suspension completely hidden, which this is a first. I've never seen that before. And we took it apart, and it's very easy to take apart, Taking the whole direction of the scooter out took me 5 minutes, maybe, for the first time, right? So with experience, I can probably do it in 2 minutes. And all the tolerance were fine. Everything was like, I didn't have to really force more than that. So I like how this is built for maintenance and being able to change it. It's brilliant. I would say though that this whole piece here comes out as one part, meaning like the direction tube, the suspension built in, and it's impossible to open. Or if somebody knows, let us know down in the comment. We tried everything with all the tools and it's sealed shut, which makes sense. Hydraulic suspension, you don't want it to leak. But I would have liked to open it to see what's inside. So yeah, we have this, and again, this is a weak spot of the scooter. You have usually the folding and the direction tube inside. When we put it on the rig, this is what always snap. And the fact that you're able to do a solid direction tube and an hydraulic suspension in one invisible that works well, pretty impressive for the pricing.
So this is probably a good moment to mention that as part of our effort to give you more than just a commentary on the scooter, we also took this exact model and we put it on our torture rig in China. So can you just explain what was the rig designed to do and how did this scooter fare on that rig?
Yes. So as you know, our scooter usually have dual motors and we have strong acceleration, and more importantly, we have regen, which translates into a lot of movement back and forth on the stem. So we need a machine that's going to be able to replicate all those cycles of accelerating when you pull on the stem and decelerating when you push on the stem. So basically the machine just do this until the scooter snap. And right now we set it up at it's 72 kilos that it's pushing and pulling, which is a lot, right?
Yeah.
From our testing, standing on a scooter, pulling on the handlebar, it was about 30 pounds that we're doing.
Max. Yeah,
Max,
even if you're a heavy rider and you're on a dual motor scooter and you're torquing it and leaning, 70 kilos, which is what, 140-ish pounds? It's a lot of force to fully exert onto the handlebar.
It's way too much. It's way too much. But that's how we test our scooter. It's always too much to have a peace of mind. And there is no benchmark established in this industry. So, we test our scooters, let's say with 70 kilos, we see it can do X amount of repetition. Then we're going to take a competitor scooter that knows it's working well and see how it compares. So all of that said, for this scooter, push and pull 13,500 cycles. So at 13,500 repetition of doing this part snapped here, which was it was this whole part here snapped.
And so, for comparison, just so the audience can have a point of reference, what is our average?
We always have scooters on those rigs, right? So when we started with, I believe, the Air 2021, we were about at that. And now if we take your latest model, that is quite similar to this, right? Front suspension, rear suspension integrated like this, which is Apollo Go. We do 45,000 cycles.
45,000, okay. And then do we see failure in the same spot on our scooters?
Same spot.
Okay.
Exact same spot.
So it's pretty consistent in terms of how the scooters fail. It's just the question of how long it takes.
Or how the rig pull on it. The rig seems to exert a pressure there, and it makes sense, right? Because you have the solid neck, and this is the point just before. And yes.
Okay. So let's move on to the tires, and actually we've got the suspension first before we move on to the tires. You already touched on the front hydraulic, but what's happening in the back there?
So the back is strange because they do say it's, at least at the beginning, they were saying that it was triple hydraulic suspension. And from what I gathered, the back is simply a spring suspension that you can adjust. I don't believe there's any oil in there. But we see this often, right? Somebody's going to launch a product, and yes, you have triple hydraulic suspension, and when people get it and start opening it, it's spring at the back and hydraulic in the front. Good suspension, works well, looks good with the little e-scooter yellow line, Max G2 in yellow. Again, design element quite nice, covered too. The angle and the type of suspension similar to what we have on the Phantom, right? So we know those suspension works well. And the thing I like the most about the suspension is how easy it is to adjust.
I think we keep coming back to the same point, which is that for one scooter, one model, it does a great job of catering to a lot of riders, right? And I think the suspension is just another example in that category, because if you're a bigger rider, if you're a heavier rider, you can just tighten the back and the scooter is going to be just as responsive. But if you're somebody lightweight and you want that cushy, bouncy suspension, you can just loosen it and it's going to be just fine as well, right? So once again,
which is not possible for the front. The front is only one setting.
Okay, tell me about the choice of tire on the scooter.
Tires are one of the best I've seen on this price point. They are 10-inch, which is great, right? For vibration, everything, way better than 8.5. And they are wide enough, those ones. So they offer good stability, but they're not completely flat. They have that little round profile to it. It's more maneuverable. Lastly, inside, as we know, there's the same the same kind of technology we use with puncture guard, which if you have a flat tire, it's going to seal it right away.
And the choice of putting the motor in the rear, right? So it's a 450 watt motor in the back. Why is it in the back and not in the front?
I think maybe there was a couple consideration for this. Segway always put the drum brake in the front. Well, that's one part of it. So maybe that's why they wanted to keep the wheel free in the front to put the drum brake. Maybe that could be an option. You can put a drum brake in those kind of wheel, but maybe for a question of cost, they wanted it separated. That's the first point. Second point, when I ride the single motor scooter, what I like is having the motor at the back, because when you take bumps, like for me, when I see crack on the ground, I always jump over them a little bit. And when all your weight is at the back with the motor and not the front, it's way easier to lift. You accelerate and you do this, and it's fun. It's adding a dimension to the riding experience to be able to lift it easily. And one of the arguments to put it in the front, like they do for most of their scooters, Segway, right? On the E2, it was in the front, and all the lower end model, it's in the front. You have more torque in traction than in propulsion. So if you put the motor in the front, it's going to feel more zippy than if you put it at the back.
Really? Just because it's like your weight distribution plays into it?
It's always like that. You always have more power when in traction than in propulsion for the same wattage, obviously, of motor. So I think this one, now that it's 450 watt, this motor, it's enough at the back that it's zippy enough.
Okay, so self-healing tires, 450 watt motor in the back. We've got the battery, which is 551 watt hours, and it's a 36 volt system. So
15H.
15H, exactly.
501?
551. So
15H.
Roughly 15H, right? Yeah. So now basically that brings us to the deck. So no better time to open it up and see what's in there and comment on the controller, the battery, and whatever else we might find in there.